He looked her up and down the way a man inspects livestock at auction, slowly, without apology, without shame, and then Charles Whitmore turned to the station master standing nearby and said, loudly enough for every soul on that platform to hear, "This isn't what I ordered." Margaret Ellison stood perfectly still in the rain. 56 years old, one suitcase, 3 weeks on a train, and a man she had never met in person was looking through her like she was a smudge on glass. "I specifically described what I was looking for," Charles continued, adjusting his coat lapel as though the whole situation was an inconvenience to his afternoon. "Someone younger, someone who could manage a household with energy. This woman is—" He paused, tilting his head. "She's clearly past that." The crowd on the platform went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people minding their business. The uncomfortable quiet of people watching something happen that they didn't know how to stop. Margaret did not move. She did not cry. She just stood there in the rain while a stranger told a crowd of people exactly what he thought she was worth, and then Charles Whitmore picked up his hat, settled it on his head, and walked away. If you've ever felt like the world looked right through you, like age or heartbreak or circumstance made you invisible, then this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next on this lonely Montana platform is going to surprise you. And if this is your first time here, subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. We tell stories about real courage, real second chances, and real life. Drop your city and country in the comments below. We want to see exactly how far this story travels. The train had been Margaret Ellison's whole world for 22 days. She had boarded it in Cincinnati with a single brown suitcase held together by a leather strap she'd replaced twice, a carpet bag that sat on her lap through most of Missouri, and a folded letter she had read so many times the crease lines had begun to separate the paper into sections. She kept the letter in the left pocket of her gray traveling coat, close enough to press her hand against when the night got long and the doubt crept in. The letter was from Charles Whitmore of Harlan County, Montana Territory. She had answered his advertisement in the Cincinnati Register 8 months earlier, on a Tuesday evening in January when the wind was coming under the door of her rented room and she had eaten her last meal of bread and cold beans and sat looking at the newspaper because there was nothing else to look at. Established rancher, 54, seeks a mature companion for matrimony. Woman of practical character preferred. Must be willing to relocate. Correspondence welcomed. She had stared at that notice for a long time. Then she had written back. Not because she was desperate, she told herself, because she was tired. There was a difference, and she needed there to be a difference. Margaret had spent 31 years married to a man named Harold Ellison, who was decent enough when he was sober and unpredictable enough when he wasn't, and who left behind exactly 4 things when he died of a chest illness 3 years ago. A woodworking bench, $2.40 in a coffee tin, a 12-year-old dog named Copper, who followed her for 11 more months before his old body gave out, and a debt she spent 2 years paying off by working in a laundry on Geary Street 6 days a week. She wasn't bitter about Harold. That would have required more energy than bitterness was worth. She was simply tired of the particular kind of loneliness that came from being a woman of 56 in a city that had no use for her. Her sister Ruth had offered her a room. Margaret had declined. Her neighbor Mrs. Pacheco had suggested the church social, where widowed women sometimes found companionship. Margaret had gone once, sat for 40 minutes, drunk 2 cups of bad coffee, and never gone back. The advertisement was not about desperation. It was about the fact that Margaret Ellison, at 56 years old, had decided she still wanted something. She just wasn't entirely sure what. Charles Whitmore's first letter arrived in March, written in a careful, slanted hand on good stationery. He described his ranch, 1,200 acres, 60 head of cattle, a house he'd built himself from timber hauled down from the ridge. He described Montana with the kind of precise detail that felt like pride. The way the light hit the mountains in the morning, the cold that arrived hard in October and didn't leave until late April, the silence of the land that some people found terrifying and he found necessary. He said he was a practical man who wanted a practical arrangement. He did not say he was looking for love, and Margaret appreciated that honesty more than she could explain. She wrote back. He wrote again. They exchanged 9 letters over 5 months. His writing was careful, sometimes stiff, like a man more comfortable with numbers than with language. But there were moments, small ones, where something genuine came through. He wrote about a horse he'd lost to colic, and the way the barn felt different afterward for weeks. He wrote about a hired hand named Santos who'd worked for him for 11 years and left to get married, and how Charles had sat on the porch that evening thinking about the word alone and what it actually meant. Margaret read that paragraph 4 times. She wrote back and told him that she understood exactly what the word alone meant, and that she had spent enough time with it to know that it wore out its welcome eventually. By July, they had agreed to meet in the town of Brixton, where Charles would be picking up a supply order. He would arrange for her train fare and accommodations. She would make her own decision from there. If they both agreed, they would proceed. If not, he would cover the cost of her return ticket. It was sensible. Margaret respected sensible. She spent August preparing. She sold the good wool blanket Harold had never used, the silver-plated hairbrush set she'd been given as a wedding gift and never loved, and 3 of the books she'd bought over the years and could part with. She used the money to have her one good dress altered and to buy a second blouse she thought might be appropriate for a frontier climate. She wrote Charles a final letter and told him she would be arriving on the 14th of September on the westbound train from St. Louis. He wrote back a single line, "I'll be at the station." She had taken those 4 words and made them into something larger than they probably were. She understood that now, sitting on the train through the long, flat miles of Wyoming, watching the land change from farmland to something wilder and less forgiving. She had built a picture in her mind, Charles standing on the platform, solid and reliable, the way his letters suggested. And she had moved into that picture and lived there for 3 weeks, which is a foolish thing to do with any image that hasn't been tested by reality. But the heart is stubborn about hope. That's the one thing Margaret had learned after 56 years that she couldn't seem to correct. The train pulled into Brixton Station at 2:30 in the afternoon on a Thursday. It was raining. Not a dramatic rain, just the thin, persistent kind that found its way down your collar and made everything look gray and slightly defeated. The platform was timber-planked and ran along a low wooden depot building with a hand-lettered sign above the door. Maybe 30 people were gathered, some waiting for the train, some meeting passengers, some simply standing around the way people did in small frontier towns when any arriving train was the day's main event. Margaret came down the step from the rail car with her suitcase in one hand and her carpet bag in the other. She was wearing her good gray coat, the one she'd kept for decent occasions, and a small hat she'd pinned carefully that morning in the train's tiny washroom. She looked, she imagined, like what she was, a woman in her middle 50s, plainly but neatly dressed, traveling alone, doing her best. She spotted Charles Whitmore immediately. He was easy to find because he was looking right at her. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been put together from corners rather than curves, and dark hair going silver at the temples. He was dressed in a good coat and clean trousers, a man who had put care into his appearance for this meeting. And for a half second, standing at the top of the platform step with the rain beginning to spot her shoulders, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Relief. He's real, she thought. He's exactly what his letters felt like. She stepped forward, and then she watched Charles Whitmore's face change. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way a window fogs in cold weather, gradually, one small degree at a time, until the view disappeared entirely. His expression shifted from recognition to surprise, and then from surprise to something that was not polite enough to call disappointment and not honest enough to call discomfort. His eyes moved over her the way a man's eyes move when he is recalculating a purchase. Margaret felt it land on her before he said a single word. She kept walking toward him because there was nothing else to do. The rain kept falling. The platform crowd kept being exactly the kind of crowd that pays too much attention to other people's business in small towns. Not rudely, just quietly, the way people do when they know they're watching something that will be discussed later. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, when she was close enough. She kept her voice even. She had practiced keeping her voice even for most of her adult life. He took a breath. "Mrs. Ellison?" "I'm sorry about the weather," she said, which was ridiculous, she knew, but it was the only neutral thing she could find. "Yes." He looked at her again, that same slow recalculation, and she felt the back of her neck go hot. "You didn't..." He stopped. Started again. Your letters didn't what? He looked away toward the depot building, then back. And then he straightened like a man making a decision he'd already made before he got there, and said quietly enough that she had to lean in slightly to hear, I was expecting someone younger. The heat in her neck moved up to her face. I see, she said. I'm not trying to be cruel about it. He said this in the same tone a man uses when he is trying to be efficient rather than kind. But I have a ranch to run. I need someone with... He paused, searching for the word. With energy. I have energy, she said. Mrs. Ellison. He said her name with a finality that closed a door. I think this was a mistake, for both of us. I can arrange for your return ticket at the depot counter. The eastbound train comes through on Saturday. She stood there. The crowd was pretending not to watch. Saturday, she repeated. Yes. He adjusted his hat brim. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. And then, and this was the part that was going to stay with Margaret for the rest of her life, the part that would come back to her in the small hours of difficult mornings for years, Charles Whitmore turned around and walked away. Not in a hurry, not shamefully, just cleanly, the way a man walks away from something he's decided isn't his problem anymore. She watched him go. Her hands were cold. She became aware of her hands being cold because they were holding the suitcase handle and the carpetbag handle, and she had stopped feeling them somewhere in the last 2 minutes. The rain was landing on her hat and running off the brim in a thin stream. Across the platform, she heard a woman say something low to the man beside her. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She moved to the far end of the platform, away from the main group, and set her suitcase down against the depot wall and her carpetbag on top of it. She sat on the bench. The wood was wet. She sat on it anyway. The last passengers from the train were moving off the platform now, being absorbed by the town, and the train itself was being serviced, water and coal, before it continued west. Margaret watched it without much feeling. Going back east meant Ruth's spare room and Mrs. Pacheco's church social and the laundry on Geary Street and the very specific weight of a life that had contracted until it fit into a single rented room. She was not going to cry on a platform in Montana. She decided this firmly, and then looked at the far mountains, which were gray-blue behind the rain and very far away and indifferent to her situation in the way that large geographical features can afford to be. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough for the crowd to thin, long enough for the light to shift, whatever small shifting was possible through that heavy cloud cover. Long enough for the cold to settle in properly through the back of her coat. She became aware of someone standing near the depot wall a few feet away. Not right beside her, not hovering, just present, the way someone is when they're trying to decide whether to approach. She looked up. He was a big man, not tall in the showy way, but large in the solid way. The way that comes from decades of physical work rather than from size. Somewhere around her age, she guessed, maybe a few years older. He had a weathered face with deep creases around the eyes and a jaw that suggested stubbornness, and he was wearing a coat that had been well made once and had been worn hard since. His hat was pulled against the rain. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify, not pity, not curiosity exactly, but something that had a quality of seriousness to it. Like a man who had already thought before he came over. Ma'am, he said. Yes. She said it neither warmly nor coldly. He looked at her suitcase, at her carpetbag, at the empty platform around her. I don't mean to intrude, he said, but are you planning to stay here all night? I haven't decided yet, she said, which was honest. He was quiet for a moment. In her experience, men who were quiet after she said something honest were usually worth paying attention to. Was that Whitmore you came to meet? He asked. She looked at him directly. You know him? Enough, he said. She waited. He seemed to understand she was waiting. He's not a man who handles surprises well, he said finally, or anything that doesn't fit exactly what he'd already decided. That's a diplomatic way to say it? Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. I'm not usually described as diplomatic. She almost said something, then didn't. My name is Elias Carter, he said. I have a ranch about 6 miles east of town. I came in today for supplies. He said it without preamble or performance, just stating the facts the way you'd give directions. I don't know your situation and I'm not asking, but the hotel in town is full. The supply train came yesterday, and the traveling men took every room, and the night temperature is going to drop hard. Margaret said nothing. I have a spare room, Elias said. It's clean. My housekeeper, Mrs. Fenn, comes in 3 days a week, and she was there this morning. You'd have privacy. I'd sleep in the barn if it makes you more comfortable. That's an unusual offer, Margaret said. Yes, he agreed. It is. Why are you making it? He took a moment with the question. She appreciated that he took a moment rather than having an answer ready. Because you're sitting in the rain at an empty train station, he said. And it's the right thing to do. That's the whole reason. Margaret looked at her suitcase. She looked at the departing train. She looked at the mountains. She had been sensible her entire adult life, and sensible had produced exactly the results she was sitting with right now. I accept, she said, on the condition that you don't sleep in the barn. I'm not the kind of woman who puts a man out of his own house. He nodded once, as though they'd settled a business matter. All right, and I'll work for the room, she said. I'm not a charity case. I didn't say you were. I'm saying it, so there's no confusion. He picked up her suitcase before she could object to that either. He was already walking toward the hitching post at the end of the platform where his wagon was tied. Margaret picked up her carpetbag and followed. She did not feel hope exactly. Hope had gotten her onto a train for 3 weeks and left her sitting in the rain. What she felt was something more cautious than hope and more stubborn than despair, a kind of battered, practical determination to keep moving until something turned out to be what it appeared to be. She climbed up onto the wagon bench while Elias untied the horse, a roan gelding with a calm expression that she immediately found reassuring. She had always trusted animals' expressions more than people's. This horse have a name? She asked. Ridley, Elias said, climbing up beside her. Good name. He picked up the reins. He's about 16, a little stiff in the mornings. I know that feeling, Margaret said. Elias glanced at her. There was something in the look she couldn't read. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it, buried under the weathering and the quiet. Then he turned back to the road and clicked the horse forward. They rode out of Brixton in the rain, and Margaret Ellison looked back once at the train station getting smaller behind them, and then looked forward at the gray road heading east toward the mountains, and thought, all right, whatever this is, all right. The ranch appeared out of the landscape the way things do in that country. Gradually, then all at once. First the fence line running alongside the road, old posts with wires strung between them, some newer repairs obvious against the older weathered wood. Then the outbuildings, a barn, and 2 smaller sheds, a corral with 3 horses standing with their rumps to the wind. Then the house itself. It was not a large house. 2 stories, timber and stone, with a covered porch running the full width of the front. Solid. Someone had built it to last and had been right about that. But the porch railing had a broken section on the left side, and the garden bed along the front was overgrown with late-season weeds, and there was a kind of emptiness to it that had nothing to do with the absence of people and everything to do with the absence of a particular kind of attention. It was a house that had been maintained but not cared for. There was a difference, and Margaret could see it immediately. Elias pulled the wagon up to the porch, and a ranch hand came out from the barn. Young man, 18 or 19, with dark hair and quick eyes. Get the supplies squared away, Elias told him. The rain's letting up later. Yes, sir. The young man, he didn't look at Margaret, but Margaret could feel him noticing her, took the horse's head and began unhitching. Elias climbed down and came around to Margaret's side. He didn't offer his hand dramatically. He just stood there in case she needed help getting down. She managed fine without it, but noticed that he'd been prepared either way. He took her suitcase again. Inside the house was exactly what the outside had suggested. Clean, functional, almost entirely without softness. There was a front room with 2 chairs and a fireplace with cold ash, a kitchen visible through a doorway, stairs going up on the left side. Everything was in order. Nothing was comfortable. This is it, Elias said. He didn't apologize for it or oversell it, just stated the fact. It's a good house, Margaret said. It's adequate. Better than adequate. She looked at the fireplace. When did you last have a fire in there? October, probably. Maybe late September. She looked at him. He wasn't joking. The spare room's up the stairs, first door on the right, he said. There should be blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed. The water comes from the pump in the kitchen, hot water you'd have to heat on the stove. He set down her suitcase at the foot of the stairs. I'll be outside until supper. There's bread in the kitchen if you're hungry. Mr. Carter, he stopped. Thank you, she said. She said it plainly, without decoration, because she meant it plainly. He nodded, the way he'd nodded when they settled their arrangement at the station. Then he went out the back door, and she heard his boots on the porch, and then nothing. Margaret stood alone in the front room of a stranger's house in Montana. She looked at the cold fireplace. She looked at the stairs. She looked at the kitchen doorway with its faint smell of old coffee and worked wood. Then she took off her coat, hung it on the hook by the front door, and went to find the firewood. She wasn't going to sit in another cold room waiting for something to happen. She'd done enough of that. The fire was still going when Elias came in from the barn that evening. He stopped in the doorway of the front room and stood there long enough that Margaret noticed, though she didn't look up from the pot she was stirring at the kitchen stove. She'd found salt pork in the cold box and dried beans in the pantry and a half onion that needed to be used. It wasn't impressive cooking, but it was food, and it would be hot, which was more than the bread on the counter could offer. You didn't have to do that, Elias said from the doorway between the front room and the kitchen. I know, she said. He was quiet. There's enough for two if you want it, Margaret said. You don't have to eat it. I'm not trying to repay you in advance for anything. I was hungry and I found the ingredients, and I'm a person who cooks when she's hungry. That's the entire explanation. She heard him pull out the kitchen chair. The one on the left side of the table, which she'd noted earlier was positioned slightly differently than the one on the right, pulled back an inch farther, like a chair that had been sat in from the same direction for years. He sat in it. All right, he said. She set two bowls on the table and sat across from him. They ate for a while without talking. The fire crackled in the front room. Outside, the rain had thinned to something barely worth naming, and in the quiet she could hear the horses moving in the corral. How long has it been like this? Margaret asked. He looked up from his bowl. The house, she said. How long since someone was keeping it properly? He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't immediately get defensive or explain himself. He just thought about it honestly. My wife died 11 years ago, he said. I'm sorry. Mrs. Ben does what she can, he said. 3 days a week. She's good at it, but she's got her own family and she doesn't live here, so. He looked at his bowl. It's adequate. You said that word before, Margaret said. Adequate. It's the right word for most things. Is it the word you actually want or the word you've settled for? He looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite surprised, but was in that vicinity, like a man who hadn't expected that particular question from that particular direction. Both, maybe, he said after a moment. She nodded. She knew that answer. She had given it herself more times than she could count. They finished the beans, she washed the bowls at the pump, while he put more wood on the fire, and then they both sat in the front room for a short, unremarkable stretch of time that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, just two strangers on either side of a fireplace with the rain going quiet outside and the situation being exactly what it was. The east fence has a section down, Elias said eventually. Been meaning to get to it before the snow. When does snow usually come? October, sometimes earlier. How many hands do you have? 2 full-time. Danny Reyes, you saw him with the horse today, and a man named Gus Pollard, been with me 8 years. Sometimes a third man for heavy season, but I haven't had the money for it this year. She looked at him. The ranch is struggling? He didn't look away. The last 2 years have been dry, lost cattle, had to sell more than I planned to keep the operation. He said it the way a man states weather facts, without shame, but without pretense either. It's manageable. It just requires careful management. Margaret thought about that for a moment. What are your costs running against income right now? She asked. Elias blinked. It was a small blink, but she caught it. That's a specific question, he said. I worked the accounts for my husband's business for 15 years, she said. Before that, I worked for a dry goods merchant in Columbus who let me balance his books because he couldn't do arithmetic past the simplest sums. I'm not asking to interfere. I'm asking because I can see from the state of the place that something isn't adding up, and I like to understand the situations I'm in. He was quiet for a beat too long. "What kind of business did your husband have?" he asked. "He made furniture. He was very good at making it, and very poor at selling it, and completely useless with money. So I handled the business side." She paused. "For what it was worth." "What happened to it?" "He died owing more than the business was worth," she said. "I spent 2 years paying it down working a laundry. That's the honest version of my situation." Elias looked at her with that same serious-faced expression she was beginning to recognize as his default. Not cold, just undecorated. "You're a straightforward woman." "I'm too old to be anything else," she said, "and I found that honesty at the beginning of a situation saves a great deal of energy later." Something shifted in his face. She couldn't have named what it was exactly, but something. "The operating costs are running about $40 a month over what the cattle revenue brings in," he said. "I've been covering it with savings from better years. Another hard winter, and those savings are gone." "Do you have debt?" "Some. The feed merchant mostly. Not catastrophic, but not comfortable." Margaret nodded slowly. "Do you keep records?" "I keep a ledger." "Can I see it tomorrow?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I have nothing else to do until Saturday," she said, "and looking at the numbers might give me something to think about other than the fact that I traveled 3 weeks to stand in the rain while a man I'd never met told me I was too old to be useful." The fire popped. Outside, something, an owl maybe, called once and went quiet. "All right," Elias said. She went to bed early that night in the spare room at the top of the stairs. The room was exactly what she'd expected from the rest of the house. Clean, plain, functional, cold. She found 3 wool blankets in the chest and put all 3 on the bed and lay under them in her clothes until the shivering stopped. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark of a stranger's house in Montana and thought about Charles Whitmore's face on that platform, the way his eyes had moved over her, slow and assessing and ultimately dismissive. And she held that image until it stopped being humiliating and became something more useful, something she could work with. He had looked at her and seen the end of something, a woman past her productive years, a mistake to be corrected and sent back. She had spent a long time believing that version herself. That was the thing she didn't like to look at directly. The part that had made his words hit as hard as they did, not because they were new, but because they echoed something she already half believed. She rolled onto her side and looked at the window. The rain had completely stopped. Through the glass she could see a scatter of stars that hadn't been visible all day, cold and distant and completely unbothered. "You're here," she told herself. "Whatever this is, you're here and not on a train going backward." She slept. In the morning she found the kitchen before Elias did. She located the coffee, ground some, and had it on the stove by the time she heard his boots on the stairs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the coffee, and then at her. "How do you take it?" she asked. "Black?" She poured 2 cups and set his on the table. He sat. She sat across from him. They drank coffee in the early morning quiet while the light came gray and clear through the kitchen window. "Ledger's in the top drawer of the desk in the front room," he said, without preface. "Thank you." He finished his coffee and went outside. She washed both cups, found bread and dried apples for breakfast, ate standing at the counter, and then went to the front room desk. The ledger was well kept, which surprised her a little and then didn't because the rest of the house was well kept too. It was just stripped of everything that wasn't strictly necessary. The numbers were recorded in a clean, careful hand, every transaction entered, every column summed. She sat in the chair by the desk and went through it methodically, page by page, going back 18 months. It took her 2 hours. What she found was not a disaster, but it was close enough to one to be concerning. Elias had been right about the $40 monthly shortfall, but that was the simple version. What she could see in the pattern of the numbers was something more structural. He was buying feed at the wrong time of year, consistently, purchasing in peak season when prices were highest rather than buying ahead when they dropped in late summer. He was also running a higher ratio of non-producing cattle than was efficient, and the timing of his beef sales showed he was selling at market trough rather than peak, probably because he needed the cash and couldn't wait for better prices. None of it was his fault in any fundamental sense. It was the math of a man managing alone, making short-term decisions because the long-term was too uncertain to plan for. But there was room in these numbers. If you tightened 3 or 4 things, changed the purchasing schedule, restructured which cattle you held and which you sold, and when, you could probably close that monthly gap significantly. She was still sitting with the ledger when she heard the back door, and Elias came through the kitchen with mud on his boots and stopped when he saw her at the desk. "Anything useful?" he asked. "Possibly," she said. "Can I show you something?" He crossed the room and stood behind her, looking at the page she had open. "Here," she said, running her finger along the feed purchase column. "What month do you typically buy your winter EA feed supply?" "September," he said. "Early October at the latest. You need it before—" "What's the price in September versus July?" He was quiet. "I don't know the July price," he said. "I've never bought in July." "If you bought in July, when the summer merchants are trying to move volume before the fall demand comes in, you'd be looking at prices that run roughly 20 to 30% lower. I'm guessing, because I don't know this specific market, but that's the typical pattern. Do you have a relationship with a feed supplier?" "I buy from Alderman's in town." "Does Alderman offer advance purchase agreements?" He was quiet again, longer this time. "I don't know," he said. "I've never asked." She turned the page. "And these cattle here, the notation says non-producing females, yearling males, and 2 older bulls. What's the plan for them?" "I was going to sell at the fall market." "That's 6 weeks from now," she said. "What's the market price typically doing in 6 weeks?" He stopped. "It's usually dropping by then, after the summer peak." "So you're planning to sell exactly when prices go down?" "I need the cash," he said. "I don't have a choice about timing." "What if you had a choice?" she said. "What if the feed purchase freed up enough operating cash that you could hold the non-producers another 4 to 6 weeks and sell when the market turns back up in late October?" He was looking at the ledger, and she could almost watch him running the numbers in his own head. He wasn't slow. He just hadn't been looking at it from this angle because he was too close to it, too deep in the day-to-day to see the pattern from the outside. "That's not a guaranteed outcome," he said. "No," she said. "It's not. But neither is selling low in a falling market and hoping you have enough left over to get through winter." He was quiet for a long time. "I'll go talk to Alderman tomorrow," he said. "One other thing," she said. She turned to the last pages of the ledger. "Your hired hand expenses. Danny Reyes, you have him logged at full daily wages even during the light weeks in July and August. He's a good worker. I didn't want to lose him to another operation." "That's sensible," she said. "But could he do a day or 2 a week at a reduced rate during those weeks, with the understanding that he gets the full rate back when the season picks up?" If it's offered as a choice and explained honestly, most workers would rather have reduced wages for a few weeks than be let go. Elias looked at her. "Danny has a mother in town he sends money to," Elias said slowly. "Reduced wages could put him in a difficult position." Margaret nodded. "Then don't do it with Danny. You know your people better than I know the numbers. The numbers are just one side of it." Something in his expression changed. She noticed it, the same small shift she'd caught the night before, something loosening underneath the weathering. "You're not wrong about the feed timing," he said. "I'm not wrong about the cattle timing either," she said. "But you know what your cash position actually is, and I don't, so I could be telling you to hold animals you genuinely can't afford to hold." "I can hold them," he said. "Probably." "That's a fairly important word," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She closed the ledger. "I'll leave it there. I've said what I saw. You'll make the calls you need to make." She got up from the desk, and Elias stepped back to give her room. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. She looked at him. He seemed to be working out how to say something. She watched him work at it for a moment, and then he said, That's a useful analysis." "You're welcome," she said. "I'm going to start on dinner. There's still salt pork, and I found dried corn in the pantry, unless you have objections to succotash." "I don't know that I've ever eaten succotash," he said. "Then tonight you'll find out whether you object to it," she said. She went to the kitchen. She did not look back, but she heard, After a moment, the sound of the desk drawer opening, and then the scratch of a pen on paper. He was writing something down. What she'd said, she suspected. The feed timing, the market calculations, some version of the idea she'd laid out. She cut salt pork into the pan and thought that this was an interesting situation. That was the honest word for it. Not comfortable, not promising in any way she could count on, not anything she could build a plan around. But interesting. The succotash turned out well. Elias ate 2 portions without comment, which she interpreted as the highest form of approval available from that particular man. The days that followed had a shape to them that Margaret hadn't anticipated. She had expected to be waiting. That was the posture she'd prepared for. The polite, static waiting of a woman in an unclear situation, occupying as little space as possible until Saturday, when she would go back to the Brixton depot and sort out a return ticket and whatever came after that. Instead, she worked. It started with the kitchen, because the kitchen needed it, and she was in it every day. The shelves were functional, but the arrangement was chaotic, supplies stacked in the order they'd been put away rather than in any order that made cooking logical. It took her most of Thursday morning to reorganize it, and when Elias came in at noon and looked at it, he said nothing for a moment and then said, "Where'd the cornmeal go?" "Second shelf from the top, left side next to the flour," she said, "with the other dry goods. Everything used daily is at eye level. Everything used weekly is above. Everything used rarely is at the top." He went to the second shelf and found the cornmeal without difficulty. He said, and that was apparently the extent of his commentary on the subject. On Friday, she asked Elias if she could walk the near pasture while he checked the fence line. He looked at her for a moment like she'd suggested something unusual and then said yes, and she put on her coat and walked the pasture with him while he checked posts and wire, and she asked questions about the herd. He answered them. Some of his answers were short and pointed. Some were longer than she expected, and she could tell when he'd gotten onto a topic he actually cared about. The quality of the grass in the north section, the particular temperament of a bull he'd bought 4 years ago from a rancher in Wyoming, the question of whether the spring runoff would hold better if he cleared the drainage channel along the east line. He talked about the ranch the way Harold had talked about furniture, with the particular specificity of a man who had put years of himself into something and thought about it even when he wasn't directly engaged with it. She found this interesting. She also found, on the south end of the pasture, a section of fence where the post had rotted at the ground level, a different section from the one he'd mentioned, one he apparently hadn't checked recently. She pointed it out without ceremony. "I see it," he said, crouching to look at the base. He pressed his hand against the post, and it shifted more than it should. He stood up with a look that was more tired than angry. "That's going to need replacing before the ground freezes." "How far does the property line run from here?" "Another quarter-mile east, then it turns north." "Are there more posts in this condition?" "Probably," he said. "It's old fence." "Then you're looking at more than one repair." "Yes," he said. He didn't say it with any particular emotion, just acknowledging the fact, putting it in the stack of other facts he was already carrying. Margaret looked at the post. She looked at the line of fence going east. She didn't say anything else about it then. But that evening, after dinner, she sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper she'd found in the desk and wrote out a list. Not a list of problems. A list of what she'd observed in 4 days at the ranch, organized by category. The fence situation, the feed purchasing question, the storage arrangements, the kitchen, the state of the back porch boards, 2 of which had soft spots she'd noticed on her 3rd day, the question of the drainage channel, the ledger analysis. She was not making this list for Elias. She was making it because she was the kind of person who needed to organize information to think clearly about it, and the information had been accumulating in her head for 4 days and needed somewhere to go. But she left it on the table when she went to bed. In the morning, it was gone. She didn't ask about it. He didn't mention it. But at noon, when she came back from hanging the wash she'd done that morning, she'd washed her own things and his work shirts, which had been in a pile in the corner of the washroom for what looked like at least 2 weeks. She found Elias in the back pasture with Danny Reyes, walking the fence line with a measuring rope, counting posts that needed replacing, working from a list. She went inside and started lunch. Saturday came, and with it the eastbound train through Brixton. Margaret did not go to the station. She did not make a formal announcement about this. She did not sit Elias down and explain her reasoning. She simply did not put on her coat and hat and asked to be driven to town. And the morning passed, and the train came through at 11, and she was in the kitchen at that point making a proper bread loaf from the starter she'd been cultivating for 4 days because the bread in the pantry had run out, and she did not see the point in running out of bread when she could make more. At noon, Elias came in, and she set out lunch, and they ate, and at some point during the meal he said without looking up, "Train came through this morning." "I know," she said. He ate another spoonful of soup. "Where are you going to sleep?" he said. "The spare room is fine," she said, "unless you need it." "I don't need it." "Then that's settled," she said. He looked up then, looked at her for a moment. "We should probably talk about what this arrangement is," he said. "Yes," she said, "we should." "I'm not—" He set down his spoon. "I'm not in a position to offer what Whitmore was offering. I told you the financial situation. I can offer a room and food and—" He paused. "Honest treatment. That's what I can offer." "That's more than Charles Whitmore offered me," she said. "That's not a high bar." "No," she said, "it's not. But it's still a real thing." He looked at her with that serious, undecorated expression. "I need help," he said. "With the ranch. With the things you've been doing this week. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm not asking you to stay because I need help. I'm saying that if you choose to stay, there's work here that matters, and I won't treat you like you're invisible." She thought about that for a moment, the specific weight of the last sentence. "Invisible," she said. "Whitmore looked right through you on that platform," Elias said. He said it quietly, but directly. "I was 20 feet away. I watched it happen." "You didn't say anything." "It wasn't my place," he said. "And I didn't know you. And I was 20 feet away, and it was over before—" He stopped. "I should have said something. I didn't. I'm sorry for that." Margaret looked at him for a long time. She had not expected that. Not the apology, and not the particular quality of it, plain and direct and offered without excusing itself. "You said something afterward," she said. "It wasn't enough." "It was what it was," she said. "And it got me out of the rain." She picked up her spoon. "Here's what I think," she said. "I think I'll stay through the fall and see what the situation looks like after the first snowfall. If it's working, we can talk about what a more permanent arrangement would look like. If it's not working for either of us, I'll make other arrangements in the spring." She looked at him. "Is that reasonable?" "That's reasonable," he said. "And I want to be clear that I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I have somewhere else to go. I have a sister in Cincinnati who offered me a room." "Why didn't you take it?" "Because I didn't come west to go back to being managed by someone else's pity," she said. "I came west because I wanted something to be different." He was quiet. Then, "And is it?" She looked around the kitchen. At the reorganized shelves, the bread dough rising in the bowl by the stove, the clean work shirts hanging on the line outside the window. "Ask me in 6 months," she said. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. Not the performance of a smile, just the faint, unguarded beginning of one, there and then gone before it could become anything. "All right," he said. He picked up his spoon. They finished lunch. Outside, Danny Reyes was already back at the south fence line, digging out a rotted post, working steadily in the autumn light. Gus Pollard was coming in from the north pasture with 2 horses he'd been checking for stone bruises. The ranch was doing what ranches do, maintaining its stubborn, difficult, demanding life, regardless of the human dramas being sorted out inside the house. Margaret cleared the table and began washing the dishes, and when she heard Elias's boots on the back porch, heading out to resume his day, she did not experience what she'd expected to feel if she ever stayed somewhere past the point of immediate necessity. She expected relief, or something like victory. What she felt instead was quieter than that and less dramatic and more real. Something that might, with time and work and a great deal of caution, turn out to be the beginning of belonging somewhere. She scrubbed the soup pot clean and set it on the shelf. Then she went back to her bread dough. The first snow came on the 3rd of October, 11 days earlier than Elias had predicted. Margaret was in the kitchen when it started, standing at the counter working butter into flour for biscuits, and she looked up at the window and watched the first flakes come sideways on a wind that had arrived overnight without much announcement. By the time she had the biscuits in the oven, the ground was white. She found Elias already in the barn when she brought his breakfast out wrapped in a cloth. He'd been there since before she got up, she gathered, because his coffee cup was cold on the kitchen table when she came downstairs. He was checking the water lines and the haystock and the general state of things with the focused efficiency of a man who had been through enough winters to know exactly what the first unexpected snow meant for everything that came after. "Eat," she said, and handed him the cloth. He took it without argument, which by this point she had come to understand as a form of trust rather than passivity. He ate the biscuit leaning against the barn door frame, watching the snow come down over the pasture with an expression she couldn't read. "How bad is this?" she asked. "Might pass in a day," he said. "Might not." He looked at the sky. "That cloud color means it might not." "What do you need done?" He glanced at her. She'd been asking that question for 3 weeks now, every time a problem surfaced, and she could tell it still caught him slightly off balance each time, not because he found it unwelcome, but because he wasn't used to it. "The cattle in the south pasture need to come into the near field," he said. "I need Danny and Gus for that. The water troughs will freeze by midday if we don't get them covered and the heat stones in. And someone needs to inventory the hay because if we're going into a hard winter early, I need to know today if we're short." "I'll do the hay," she said. "It's cold in there." "I know it's cold in there," she said. "I'm standing in it." He looked at her for one more moment, then nodded and went to find his men. The hay inventory took her the better part of the morning. She worked methodically through the barn's upper and lower storage, counting bales, estimating the loose hay in the far stall, doing the arithmetic in her head against the numbers she'd memorized from the ledger about how many head they were carrying and what the average winter consumption looked like. By the time she was finished, her hands were stiff and her breath had been visible for 4 hours straight, and there was hay in her hair and down the back of her collar. She came out of the barn and found Elias crossing the yard from the near field. "We're short," she said without preface. He stopped. "How short?" "If this winter runs long, 3 to 4 weeks short," she said. "If it's mild and ends on time, you're probably fine. But you told me yourself that last year ran cold through mid-April." He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair, which she had observed him do exactly twice before, both times when something had gone wrong. "Aldermans won't have anything left to sell at a price I can manage. The fall rush already came through." "Is there anyone else?" "There's a man named Birch. Farms out past the Henderson place, about 9 miles. He usually has surplus, but—" Elias put his hat back on. "We don't have a simple history." "What does that mean?" "It means we had a disagreement 4 years ago about a fence line, and he hasn't spoken to me directly since." Margaret looked at him. "What was the disagreement about?" "He was wrong about where the line was," Elias said. "And I told him so." "Were you right?" "Yes." "Did you have to tell him the way you told him?" A pause. "Probably not." She folded her arms against the cold. "How much surplus does he typically carry into winter?" "More than he needs. He's cautious about his stock, overfeeds if anything." "Then I'll go talk to him," she said. Elias looked at her like she'd suggested something in a foreign language. "You don't know Birch." "No," she said, "which means I don't have a 4-year disagreement with him either." He opened his mouth and then closed it again. "I'll take Ridley in the small wagon," she said. "I'll be back before dark. What's a fair price to offer per bale if he has what we need?" He told her. She went inside to put on her heavy coat and her good gloves, the ones she'd bought in Cincinnati for the winter and had been glad of every morning since. She found the Birch farm without much trouble, following Elias's directions along the snow-tracked road until a farm appeared out of the gray afternoon, bigger than she'd expected, with a solid stone foundation on the house and well-kept fencing along the road frontage. A man came out of the barn when she pulled up, 60 or so, red-faced from the cold, with a suspicious expression that was probably his default. "Help you?" he said. "Mr. Birch," she said from the wagon seat. "My name is Margaret Ellison. I'm staying at the Carter Ranch." His expression didn't change. If anything, it got slightly more closed. "I'm not here about the fence line," she said. "I don't know anything about the fence line, and I don't have an opinion about it. I'm here because we came up short on hay after this early snow, and Mr. Carter said you sometimes carry surplus. Birch looked at her for a long moment. Carter sent a woman to do his asking, he said. Mr. Carter didn't send me, she said evenly. I offered to come because I was under the impression that you and he had some difficulty speaking directly to each other, and buying hay seemed more important than whose difficulty that was. She held his gaze. I'm right that you carry surplus? Another long look. Then something in his face that wasn't quite a thaw, but was the first movement in that direction. What are you looking to buy? He said. She told him. They negotiated for 12 minutes, standing in the cold, and she paid 6 cents less per bale than Elias had told her to expect to pay, because she had noticed when she arrived that the far side of Birch's barn had a newer addition that wasn't fully completed, and a man with a construction debt usually wanted cash more than he wanted to hold a price. She drove back to the Carter Ranch with 17 additional bales stacked in the wagon, arriving just before the light went, and pulled up to the barn where Elias and Danny were finishing the evening feeding. Elias came out and stood looking at the loaded wagon. He talked to you? He said. He talked to me, she said. What did you pay? She told him. He said nothing for a moment. That's less than I expected, he said. He has a barn addition he's trying to finish before the hard freeze, she said. He needed the cash. Elias looked at the bales, and then at her, and then at the bales again. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said. Help me get these inside before it gets dark. The winter settled in properly after that, the way Montana winters did. Not all at once in a single dramatic event, but in a series of deepening commitments, each cold morning colder than the last. The daylight shortening by measured degrees until the afternoons felt like early evening and the evenings felt like the middle of the night. The ranch contracted inward. The work changed from the wide-ranging labor of the warmer months to the focused, repetitive work of survival, feeding, watering, checking, maintaining, keeping things alive through the cold. Margaret found a rhythm in it. She had not expected to. She had expected winter on a frontier ranch to feel like siege, closed in, limited, suffocating. Instead, she found that the enforced smallness of it suited something in her that had never fit well with Cincinnati's particular brand of busyness. She woke early, when the house was still dark, and the only sound was the wind against the walls. And she started the kitchen fire, and put the coffee on, and had 20 minutes of silence that belonged entirely to her before the rest of the household stirred. Those 20 minutes became important in a way she didn't fully explain to herself. She had not had a piece of time that was simply hers since Harold died, and in the years before Harold died, it had been his illness that took all the available air. 20 minutes every morning was small. It was also enormous. The household had acquired a texture by November that neither she nor Elias had explicitly designed. He went to bed when the work was done and got up before light. She organized the domestic side with the same systematic attention she'd applied to the ledger in her first days. Not because she needed to control things, but because organization was her natural language, the same way that quiet persistence was his. They didn't talk about this. They didn't need to. It worked because each of them was good at different things, and neither of them was precious about which things those were. What they did talk about was the ranch, the cattle, the hay supply, the spring planning, the question of whether to add a third full-time hand when the season turned. Elias talked about these things differently with her than she suspected he talked about them with Danny or Gus. Not the way a man talks to another rancher or to employees, but more fully, turning the question over to see all its sides because he knew she would do the same. She found this unusual. Harold had not talked to her about the furniture business in that way. Harold had told her the numbers when he needed her to manage them, and otherwise treated the business as his separate territory. She had managed his books for 15 years and never been consulted about a single decision regarding the actual work. She was not sure what to do with the fact that a man she'd known for 6 weeks consulted her more genuinely than a man she'd been married to for 31 years. She stored the fact away and thought about it in her 20 quiet morning minutes. In November, she also discovered Gus Pollard. She had registered him as a presence, a solid, quiet man in his early 50s who did his work without complaint and seemed to regard her with neither hostility nor particular curiosity. She had seen him mostly at a distance, in the yard or the pasture, and had exchanged maybe 40 words with him total in the first 6 weeks. Then one morning she found him in the barn trying to treat a young heifer's infected leg wound with a poultice that was going to make the infection worse, not better, and she said so. He looked up at her with an expression that was not quite hostile, more like a man who had learned to be cautious about opinions from unexpected directions. "Mrs. Fenn's recipe," he said. "Mrs. Fenn is a good housekeeper," Margaret said. "Is she a doctor?" "No." "That poultice has tobacco in it," she said. "For a skin wound at that location, you want something that draws the infection out, not something that introduces more inflammation. Do you have any dried plantain in the house?" "The weed?" "It has medicinal properties that most people overlook because it grows in inconvenient places," she said. "If you don't have it dried, I need to know if it's still findable under the snow along the south fence. I saw it growing there in October." Gus looked at the heifer, looked at the poultice jar, looked at Margaret. "You know medicine?" he said. "I know what I've learned," she said. "My mother grew herbs, and my neighbor in Cincinnati had a medical guide she let me borrow a long time ago. I'm not making any grand claims. I'm telling you that poultice is wrong for that wound, and I think I know something better." He let her work on the heifer. It took 3 days, and the wound didn't clear up cleanly. It went worse before it went better. And there was a day in the middle where Gus stood in the barn doorway looking at the animal with an expression that said plainly that he thought Margaret had made things worse. But on the 4th day, the infection broke properly, and by the end of the week, the heifer was bearing weight on the leg again. Gus didn't say much about it, but after that, when Margaret came into the barn, he nodded at her in a way he hadn't before. Not deference, not gratitude exactly, just a nod that contained respect. The kind of small acknowledgement that a practical man extends to another practical person after they've proven a point. She found she valued that nod considerably. Danny Reyes was easier, in a different way. He was 19, curious by nature, and had a directness that came from youth. He hadn't yet learned to flatten his reactions the way adults did. When Margaret first reorganized the kitchen, he'd looked at it with open interest and said, "That's a better system." When she'd taught him the advance purchase arithmetic for the feed buying, he'd sat at the kitchen table with the paper in front of him and asked 3 follow-up questions that were smarter than she'd expected. He was quick. He was also, she noticed, sending half his wages home every month. She'd seen the addressed envelopes on the hall table twice, and buying himself exactly nothing. In December, she made him a pair of work gloves from a piece of old harness leather she found in the barn, and some lining material from a worn coat she'd cut down. She left them on the hall table next to his outgoing mail. He came in from the morning work and stopped at the table and picked them up and looked at them, and then looked at her, and his face did the thing young faces do when something gets through their composure. "You made these?" he said. "I had time," she said. "The leather was going to waste." He put them on. They fit because she'd been looking at his hands for 2 months. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Take care of your hands," she said. "You need them for the next 50 years. He grinned, a quick, real grin, and went back out into the cold. Elias watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. But at dinner that evening, he said somewhat abruptly, "Danny's been talking about staying on for the spring. He wasn't sure about it in the fall." "Is that good?" Margaret asked. "He's good at what he does," Elias said, "and reliable workers are difficult to find and keep." "Then it's good," she said. "Yes," he said, and looked at her for a moment over the dinner table. "It is." She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything else about it. December moved into January, and the cold became absolute. The kind of cold that had a physical presence, a weight, an intention to it, that made the house's warmth feel like something you had to actively maintain rather than simply have. The fireplace ran all day. The kitchen stove ran hotter than it had in the fall. She learned the house's drafts and blocked them with rolled cloth. She learned which windows let in the most cold and hung extra fabric over them at night. She also learned that Elias didn't sleep well in January. She heard him sometimes, in the deep of the night, moving through the house, not restless pacing, just the sound of him getting up, going to the kitchen, sometimes the front room. She never heard him go outside. He'd come back to bed eventually, she assumed, because the sounds would stop. She didn't say anything about it. It wasn't her business, and she knew what bad sleep looked like. She'd had her own version of it for 3 years after Harold died, lying in the dark with her mind running its pointless, exhausting circuits. But one night in late January, she got up herself, at whatever hour it was, for a glass of water, and found him sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a piece of paper in front of him with numbers on it. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She went to the stove and moved the coffee pot onto the hot plate and stood waiting for it to warm. "What are you working on?" she asked. "Spring figures," he said, trying to work out the cattle numbers for late March, whether to buy 2 additional breeding females or hold the cash. She looked at the paper from across the table. "May I?" He turned it to face her. She sat down and looked at the numbers. She asked 2 questions. He answered them. She thought about it for a moment and then said, "You'd be better served holding the cash until you see what the winter losses actually look like. You might have enough producing females already if the winter mortality is lower than you're projecting." "It might not be lower," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you're projecting the worst case. What's the realistic case?" He was quiet, calculating. 2, maybe 3 head lost, if nothing goes badly wrong. Then at the realistic loss number, you have enough breeding stock to hold through next fall, and you'd be buying ahead of what you actually need. He looked at the paper. "Keep the cash," she said. "Buy in the fall if the herd numbers say you need to. You'll know more then." He sat back. "That's what I was leaning toward," he said. "But I wasn't—" He stopped. "Certain?" she said. "It helps to say it out loud to someone who understands the numbers," he said. He said it simply, without making it into anything, but it landed with a weight that she felt precisely. She poured them both coffee. They sat at the kitchen table and drank it, in the 2 a.m. quiet of a January night, with the cold pressed against the walls and the fire low in the other room. "Your wife," Margaret said, after a while. "Did she know the ranch the way you do?" He was quiet for a moment. Eleanor understood it. She wasn't interested in the business side of it. She was interested in the land. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. She could tell you what was growing in any given spot in any given season. She knew the birds by sound. Things I couldn't tell you now if you asked me. "Do you miss that?" "I miss her," he said. "That's a different thing from missing the specific things she knew. But yes, some of those things too." He looked at the window, dark and winter blank. 11 years is a long time to talk to nobody." "Yes," Margaret said. "It is." He looked at her. "How long were you by yourself?" 3 years since Harold died," she said. "But I was alone for longer than that. He was sick for a long time before he died." "That's a different kind of alone," Elias said. "Yes," she said. "The kind where you're not allowed to say you're alone because you're taking care of someone." He was quiet. "That's the most accurate thing anyone has said about it," she said, "including me, to myself." The fire settled in the other room. Outside, the wind moved along the walls and went on. "Thank you," she said finally, "for that first night at the station." "You thanked me already," he said. "I thanked you for the shelter," she said. "This is different." He looked at her. "You looked at me on that platform," she said, "and you saw a person, not an inconvenience, not a mistake, not a woman who was too old to be useful." She held his gaze. "I haven't said that directly, and I should have." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "It wasn't a difficult thing to do," he said. "It was the only thing you did that night," she said. "And it was everything." He looked down at his coffee cup. The set of his jaw changed slightly. That infinitesimal internal shift she'd learned to read over 3 months as the outward sign of something he was not going to say, working through him. She did not push it. She finished her coffee and took her cup to the sink and said goodnight, and went back to her room at the top of the stairs. She lay in the dark under her 3 blankets and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word everything and whether she had meant it exactly as she'd said it. She had. That was the plain truth. One human being who looked at another human being in a moment of total humiliation and saw a person rather than a problem, that was everything. You could build a great deal from a foundation like that. She slept better than she had in a long time. February brought a thaw that lasted 4 days, long enough to raise false hopes, and then a hard freeze that came back worse than before and split 2 water pipes in the barn and kept everyone working through a 48-hour stretch that left all of them ragged-edged and short-tempered. Margaret kept the kitchen running and the coffee available, and did not take personally the fact that Elias answered 3 of her questions in a row with one-word responses. She had watched her own patients fray in worse situations, and she understood that survival mode did not make room for pleasant conversation. When it was over, when the pipes were repaired and the water restored and the cattle accounted for, Elias sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands for 30 seconds. Just that. Not dramatic, not long. 30 seconds of a man letting his body acknowledge what it had just been through. Then he lifted his head and said, "Is there anything left to eat?" "There's stew," she said. "It's been on all day." She set a bowl in front of him and he ate it without looking up. And she sat across from him with her own bowl and ate, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. March came, and with it, the first real suggestion that winter might eventually release its hold. The light changed first, lengthening by degrees, arriving earlier in the morning, staying longer at the end of the day. Then the temperature swinging between cold and briefly warm in a way that felt almost experimental, as though the season was testing the idea of changing before committing to it. The ranch began its spring preparations, and with the expanding work came an expanding visibility for Margaret's role in it. She had been present and useful all winter. But winter work was mostly invisible. The maintaining, the organizing, the feeding, the keeping things alive through the cold. When spring came and the ranch opened back up, what she had done over the previous 6 months became apparent in the way a painting becomes apparent when the light finally hits it right. The feed supply was not just adequate, it was planned. The advance purchase from Alderman's had come through exactly as she'd calculated, at the lower price, and there was enough surplus to carry them comfortably past the point where the grass came in, which meant no scrambling, no emergency buying at the worst prices. The ledger showed a month in December and a month in February that had come in under the monthly shortfall for the first time in the previous year's pattern. Small gains, but real ones. Danny Reyes, who had officially signed on for the spring in February, had taken to consulting Margaret on supply questions with a naturalness that had developed so gradually neither of them had noticed it happening. "Mrs. Ellison, Alderman's is saying the price on oats is going up next month. Should we buy now?" He said it with the same matter-of-fact tone he used to ask Elias about cattle decisions. It was simply how the ranch worked now. Gus was more complicated because Gus was Gus, a man who'd been managing his way for 30 years and had a 30-year investment in his own judgment. But the heifer's leg had done its work. He didn't ask her questions. He did, however, stop arguing with her suggestions, which was a different form of the same respect, and she'd take it. What changed in March was the town. She had been to Brixton twice over the winter, both times on supply runs with Elias, and both times she had been aware of being looked at in that particular way that small frontier towns look at new people, assessing, categorizing, placing. She was registered as Elias Carter's woman, which was not accurate but was the nearest available category, and she had not bothered to correct it because the correction would have required more explanation than it was worth in a supply run conversation. But in March, when the roads cleared enough for regular traffic and the social life of the town began reasserting itself after the winter's contraction, Margaret went into Brixton on her own. She went for the specific purpose of talking to a woman named Clara Hendricks, who ran the post office and, more usefully, the informal network of information that kept a small frontier town functionally aware of itself. She had heard Clara's name mentioned by Elias in connection with the Birch situation. Apparently Clara had known about the fence dispute before most of the people directly involved, which told Margaret what she needed to know about Clara's position in the town's information structure. She found Clara at the post office window, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s with the particular watchful quality of someone who has made it their business to know things. "You're the woman at Carter's place," Clara said, before Margaret had finished introducing herself. "Margaret Ellison," Margaret said. "Yes." "I heard Charles Whitmore left you standing at the station in the rain," Clara said, not cruelly, just factually, in the way of someone confirming a reported incident. "He did," Margaret said. "He's a fool," Clara said, in the same tone. What can I do for you? Margaret told her. She was interested in whether any of the smaller ranches or farms in the area were carrying debt with the local merchants that might be affecting their purchasing decisions on supplies. Not personal financial information, she wasn't asking Clara to betray confidences, but general patterns. Were their operations struggling with the same feed cost timing issues that Carter's ranch had been working through? Clara looked at her for a long moment. Why do you want to know? She said. Because if they are, Margaret said, there might be an advantage in some kind of coordinated buying arrangement. A few ranches committing to advance purchase together could negotiate better prices than any one of them can get individually. Clara's sharp eyes didn't change their sharpness, but something behind them shifted. You've been thinking about this for a while, Clara said. Most of the winter, Margaret said. There are 3 operations I can think of, Clara said, that have been buying feed late in the season and paying the high price for the last 2 or 3 years. And yes, it's affecting what they can do with the rest of their operating budget. She paused. You're proposing they coordinate. I'm asking whether they might be interested in talking about it, Margaret said. Whether they'd be willing to sit in the same room with each other and discuss it is another question. Birch won't be in the same room with Carter, Clara said. I know, Margaret said. I bought hay from Birch in October. We talked about other things while we negotiated. Clara studied her. You're not what I expected Carter's arrangement to look like, she said. I'm not exactly what anyone expected, Margaret said. That's been established. Something happened in Clara Hendrick's face that Margaret recognized after a half-second as genuine amusement, the real kind, not the performed kind. She had been in this town for 6 months, and this was the first time she had seen that expression directed at her. Come back in 2 weeks, Clara said. I'll have talked to some people. Margaret came back in 2 weeks, and the conversation Clara had been having on her behalf had produced 2 ranchers willing to discuss a cooperative buying arrangement, and one who was interested but had reservations about his relationship with the alderman merchant. The 4 of them met in the back room of Clara's post office, which turned out to double as the informal meeting room for any Brixton business that needed conducting without ceremony. Margaret ran the meeting. Not because she had declared herself in charge of it, but because she was the one who had called it, had the numbers prepared, and knew what outcome she was trying to reach. She laid out the arithmetic clearly and answered the questions that came at her, some skeptical, some genuinely curious, without defensiveness or performance. At the end of 2 hours, they had the outline of an agreement. Not a signed document, nothing legal, just 4 people who had committed to putting in a joint advance order to aldermen before the next summer season, with coordinated timing based on the price patterns Margaret had researched through the winter. It was a small thing. It was also a real thing. She drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the light going golden over the mountain line, thinking about what small things could eventually add up to. She did not see, when she turned onto the road that led to the Carter property, the figure on horseback coming from the opposite direction, heading toward town, not away from it, slowing as she passed, and turning to watch her wagon go. She did not see him, but he saw her, and he recognized her. Charles Whitmore sat on his horse in the middle of the road and watched Margaret Ellison drive past in a wagon that belonged to Elias Carter's operation, sitting straight in the seat, looking like a woman who knew exactly where she was going. He had not expected her to still be here. He had, in fact, spent the winter not thinking about her at all, which he had managed adequately until approximately mid-February, when his business arrangement with his 2 primary investors had begun to unravel in ways he had not anticipated. His partners had been asking questions about the land valuation that he had presented to them the previous summer, and some of their questions had started producing answers that Charles found inconvenient. He watched Margaret's wagon until it turned off the main road and disappeared behind the tree line. He thought about the fact that she had bought hay from Birch in October, because Birch had mentioned it to someone who had mentioned it to someone else, and in a town the size of Brixton, everything got back to everyone eventually. He thought about the cattle timing changes he'd heard attributed to Carter's operation. He thought about the meeting at the post office 2 weeks ago, which Clara Hendricks had not told him about directly, but which his cook's wife, who had been buying stamps that afternoon, had mentioned in passing. He sat on his horse in the cold March air and thought about the woman he had left standing in the rain. and then he turned his horse toward town and rode on. He was going to be in Brixton more frequently in the coming weeks. His business required it, and the situation required management. He told himself this was about business. But the ranch wagon had already disappeared and the road was empty, and Charles Whitmore was a man who was beginning to understand, for the first time, what he had walked away from on a rainy September afternoon. Charles Whitmore came to the ranch on a Tuesday in early April, when the snow had pulled back from the lower fields, and the mud season was in full, unglamorous force. Margaret was in the yard hanging laundry when she heard the horse on the road. She didn't look up immediately. Horses came and went on the road regularly, supply wagons and neighboring ranchers, and Danny's occasional trips to town. She finished pinning the shirt she was holding before she turned. She recognized him at 50 yards. Her hands didn't stop moving. She reached into the basket for the next shirt and kept her eyes on him as he came through the gate and pulled his horse up a reasonable distance from where she stood. He was dressed well, better than the occasion seemed to call for, in a coat that was newer than anything she'd seen him in at the station and a hat that had not spent a winter working in it. He looked the same. That was the first thing she registered, and it annoyed her that she'd expected him to look different, as though the months since September should have left some visible mark on a man who had simply walked away from a train platform and gotten on with his life. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He dismounted, because sitting on a horse while a woman stood on the ground was a particular kind of rudeness that even Charles Whitmore apparently understood. He held his horse's reins and looked at her with an expression she recognized after a moment, as one she'd seen before on men who needed something and were working out how to ask for it. "You're looking well," he said. She picked up another shirt. "I didn't expect you to still be in the territory," he said. "I expect there are a number of things about the last 6 months that weren't what you expected," she said. He took a small breath. "I'd like to talk with you, if you have a few minutes." "I'm listening," she said. She didn't stop hanging laundry. He glanced at the house, then back at her. He had wanted to go inside, she understood. Wanted the formality of chairs and a table, the performance of a proper conversation in a proper setting. She kept her hands moving because she had not invited him here, and she was not going to rearrange her morning for him. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. Not at his face, exactly. More at the general fact of him, standing in the mud of a working ranch yard in his good coat, saying something she'd spent 6 months deciding she didn't need to hear. "Yes," she said, "you do." He hadn't expected her to agree that plainly. She could see the small recalibration happening behind his eyes. "What I did at the station was wrong," he said. "The way I spoke to you. In front of those people, I've thought about it, and I'm not proud of it." "Good," she said. Another recalibration. He was used, she suspected, to women who made apologies easier by accepting them quickly, by saying it's all right or I understand or something else that moved the transaction along and let both parties get back to neutral ground. She wasn't going to do that. "I made a judgment based on something that was none of my business to judge," he said. "You made a judgment based on my age," she said, "which you did publicly in front of a crowd after I had traveled 3 weeks to meet you. That's the accurate description." "Yes," he said. He held her gaze. "That's the accurate description." She put the last shirt on the line and picked up the empty basket. "What is it you actually want, Mr. Whitmore?" she said. "Because I don't think you rode out here to apologize. Men who want to apologize don't wait 7 months to do it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to talk about the possibility of reconsidering our arrangement," he said. She looked at him. "My circumstances have changed," he said. "I've had some difficulties this winter with my business operations that have caused me to reassess some priorities, and I've heard from people in town about the work you've been doing here, the buying arrangement you organized with the other ranches, the changes in Carter's operation." He paused. "You're not what I dismissed at that station, Mrs. Ellison. I understand that now." She let the silence sit for a moment. "You understand it now," she said. "Yes." "Because you've heard I'm useful," she said. "Because your business is in trouble and you've been reassessing priorities." The color in his face shifted slightly. "That's not the only reason. It's the reason you're here today instead of 7 months ago," she said. "Be honest about that, at least." He was quiet. Whatever version of this conversation he'd rehearsed on the ride over, It hadn't accounted for her being this direct, and she wasn't going to help him find his footing. You said you could offer me a large house and financial security and the status of being a successful rancher's wife, she said. Is the house still large? Is the financial security still solid? The color in his face shifted again, more definitively this time. The ranch is sound, he said. You didn't answer about the financial security. There have been some complications with my investment arrangements, he said carefully. Nothing that can't be resolved. What kind of complications, she said. That's a private business matter. You're asking me to reconsider a marriage arrangement based partly on financial security, and then telling me the financial details are private, she said. You understand how those two things don't work together. Elias's voice came from behind her. Whitmore. She turned. Elias was standing at the corner of the house. He'd come around from the back, probably from the barn, and had been there for at least a minute. His expression was the same expression he used for most things. Level, undecorated, impossible to read quickly. Charles looked at him. Carter. You're on my property, Elias said. Not aggressively, just stating the fact. I came to speak with Mrs. Ellison, Charles said. I can see that. Elias looked at Margaret. Not to check what she wanted him to do, more the way a man looks at someone to confirm they're all right. She gave him a small, deliberate nod. He leaned against the corner of the house and stayed where he was. Charles looked back at Margaret. The presence of Elias behind her had changed the configuration of the conversation, and she could see him trying to adapt to it. I'd like to take you to dinner in town, Charles said, to talk properly, not standing in a yard. I'm not interested in dinner, she said. Margaret, Mrs. Ellison, she said. He stopped. You're welcome to say what you came to say right here, she said. I'm not being unkind. I'm being clear. Whatever you want to discuss, you can discuss it now. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him calculating. The same slow calculation she'd first seen on the train platform, running the numbers on what he had in front of him, deciding what it was worth. Only this time the calculation was more complicated because what he was looking at had changed. I made a mistake, he said finally. A significant one. And I'm asking you to consider whether that mistake has to be permanent. What you did at that station, she said, was the clearest possible demonstration of how you think about people. You saw what you expected to see, and it didn't match what you wanted, and you walked away without a second thought. That's not a mistake. That's a character. He flinched. Small, but she saw it. People can change, he said. They can, she agreed. But you haven't been in front of me for 7 months changing. You've been in front of me for 20 minutes trying to recover a situation that went against you. She let that land. Those aren't the same thing. Behind her, she heard the faint sound of Elias's boot shifting against the ground. Charles looked from her to Elias and back again. Is this about Carter? This is about me, Margaret said. What's between Carter and me is not your business. You came here for him, Charles said. It came out slightly sharper than he'd intended. She could hear the sting in it, the thing beneath the polished coat and the careful words. I didn't come here for anyone, she said. I came west because I wanted something different, and I found it. Not because someone offered it to me, because I built it. Charles was quiet. I accept your apology, she said. I mean that genuinely. What you did was wrong, and it hurt, and I accept that you've said so. But an apology and a marriage proposal are different things, and accepting one doesn't mean considering the other. She picked up her laundry basket. I hope your business difficulties resolve themselves, she said. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. She walked toward the house. She did not look back. She heard him stand in the yard for a moment, and then the sound of his horse moving, and then hooves on the road going back toward town. Inside the house, she set the laundry basket down and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands on the counter, not quite shaking, but close to it. Not from fear, she understood, but from the particular physical release of adrenaline after a moment of controlled intensity. The back door opened and Elias came in. He went to the stove and poured coffee, then set a second cup on the table. He sat down. He didn't say anything. She sat across from him and picked up the cup. How long were you standing there? She asked. Long enough, he said. You didn't have to stay. No, he agreed. She drank her coffee. His business is in trouble, she said, more than he admitted. The way he talked around it, she shook her head slightly. He's in a difficult position, and he's looking for solutions, and I was a solution he'd already dismissed, and now he's reconsidering the dismissal. You knew that before he started talking, Elias said. I suspected it, she said. Clara mentioned last week that there was talk about Whitmore's investment partners. Something about land valuations that didn't match what he'd represented. She looked at her cup. What kind of land valuations? Elias was quiet for a moment. Whitmore bought a large parcel east of town 2 years ago. He sold investment shares in it to 3 other men based on its agricultural value. But some people have been saying the eastern portion of that land has a water rights problem, a prior claim from an upstream property that would limit what Whitmore's parcel can actually support. Did Whitmore know about the prior claim when he sold the shares? That's the question people are asking, Elias said. Margaret sat with that for a moment. That's not a business difficulty, she said. That's a potential fraud. Elias said nothing. If he represented the land value to investors without disclosing a known water rights claim, she said slowly, and they bought shares based on that representation. I'm not a lawyer, Elias said. Neither am I, she said. But I can read a ledger and I can follow a logic. She looked at him. Who are the investors? Harlan Morse is one. He has a dry goods business in town. The other 2 are men from out of the territory. I don't know them. Harlan Morse, Margaret said. She knew the name. She'd bought supplies from his store 3 times over the winter. He was a quiet man with a family who ran his business carefully and who had mentioned in passing, the last time she'd been in, that spring had been slower than he'd hoped. Does Morse know about the water rights claim? She asked. I don't know what Morse knows, Elias said. She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at him. I think I need to talk to Clara again. Elias looked at her steadily. Margaret. He said her first name. He used it occasionally, had started using it sometime in February without either of them marking the transition. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that a man who commits fraud against his neighbors in a small community does damage that spreads past the original transaction, she said. Morse is one person, but if Whitmore's scheme falls apart badly, it takes money out of the local economy. It makes people in this community more cautious, more contracted. It affects who buys supplies and when, which affects what the feed merchant can carry, which affects what your advance purchase arrangement is able to secure next season. She paused. Everything is connected. You can't fix every problem in Harlan County, he said. It wasn't unkind, just direct. I know that, she said, but I might be able to make sure Harlan Morse understands what he's invested in before it's too late for him to do anything about it. Elias was quiet for a long time. Be careful, he said finally. Whitmore is not a man who'll respond well to being exposed. I'm not planning to expose him, she said. I'm planning to make sure the people he's taken advantage of have the information they need to protect themselves. That's a different thing. He looked at her. Is it? He said. Yes, she said. One is about punishing someone. The other is about protecting people. The outcome might look similar from the outside, but the intention is different, and the intention matters. He considered that. All right, he said. She went to see Clara Hendricks the following morning. The conversation was careful and took most of an hour, sitting in the back room of the post office with the door closed and 2 cups of tea going cold between them. Clara was not a woman who startled easily, but Margaret watched something shift in her expression when the water rights claim was laid out clearly and its implications spelled through. If Whitmore knew, Clara said. If he knew, Margaret agreed. I don't have proof of that, but the question is whether Morse and the other investors were given the information they needed to make an informed decision when they bought in. And you think they weren't? I think it's worth Morse asking the question directly, Margaret said, before the spring planting season commits his capital further. Clara looked at her. You're asking me to get Morse in a room with someone who can walk him through what to ask. I'm asking whether you think that conversation would be useful, Margaret said carefully. You know the people in this community. You know what's appropriate and what isn't. I'm not asking you to do anything that isn't yours to decide. Clara was quiet for a moment. There's a man named Garrett, she said. He came through Brixton last fall, said he'd be back in the spring. He handles legal and land matters for ranches in this part of the territory. He knows water rights law. Is he back? Margaret asked. He came in on the Monday stage, Clara said. He's staying at the hotel. Margaret held Clara's gaze. If you thought Garrett and Morse should have a conversation, would you be able to arrange it? I arrange conversations for this town every week, Clara said flatly. It's an unofficial public service. Then I'll leave that to your judgment, Margaret said. She rode back to the ranch and said nothing to Elias about Garrett, not because she was hiding it, but because it wasn't completed yet, and she had learned over the winter that Elias didn't find comfort in half-formed plans. He found comfort in outcomes. She would tell him when there was something to tell. April moved forward. The mud dried from the fields, and the grass began its early push, that specific, particular green of Montana spring that she had not known about before she arrived and now looked for every morning from the kitchen window. The ranch expanded again into its full working mode, longer days, more men, the productive chaos of calving season beginning in the north pasture. She helped with 2 difficult births because she was there and had steady hands, and Danny asked without thinking about whether it was an appropriate request. And she understood that being asked without thinking about appropriateness was its own form of acceptance. She came in from the second one with blood on her coat sleeves and straw in her hair and found Elias at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the evening ledger, and he looked at her for a moment. How'd it go? He said. Both calves are up, she said. He nodded. Wash up, there's food on the stove. She washed at the pump and sat down and ate what turned out to be a reasonable attempt at a beef and vegetable soup. He'd made it himself, she understood, because she'd been in the pasture for 3 hours past the time she'd planned. She looked at the soup and then at him. You made this, she said. Boiling water and putting things in it is not beyond me, he said, without looking up from the ledger. It's good, she said. Don't oversell it, he said. It's adequate. She almost laughed. She caught it before it became a full laugh. Not because she was suppressing it, but because it arrived so quickly and so genuinely that it surprised her. She hadn't laughed quickly and genuinely in a long time. The laugh she'd had with Harold in the last years had been the effortful kind you produce because the situation suggests it, not because your body decided to. She ate the soup and he worked in the ledger, and outside the April evening was cool and clear, and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet around them. 3 days later, Clara sent word. The message came through Danny, who'd stopped at the post office for the ranch mail, and it was brief. Just Clara's name and the words tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock, if you can manage it. Margaret told Elias she was going to town and he asked no questions, which by now was simply how they operated. She arrived at the post office at 1:45 and found, in the back room, Clara and a thin, precise man in his 40s who turned out to be Garrett, and Harlan Morse, who was sitting with his hat on his knee looking like a man who had suspected something unpleasant for some time and had finally agreed to have it confirmed. Garrett did most of the talking. Margaret sat to the side and answered 2 specific questions about the patterns she'd noticed in the ledger numbers she'd examined. Not Whitmore's ledger, which she'd never seen, but the secondary effects she'd observed in the way the feed merchants' pricing had moved over the winter, which Garrett used as a data point in a larger picture he was building. The conversation lasted an hour and a half. When it was over, Morse sat for a moment with his hat still on his knee, looking at the table. He knew about the water claim, Morse said, not a question. There's a document filed with the Territorial Land Office from 14 months ago, Garrett said. Before your investment, it references the prior claim directly. Morse was quiet. What are my options? He said. Garrett told him. It was not a short list, but it was not without paths forward, and the tone of it was that Morse was not without recourse if he moved carefully and promptly. Margaret did not speak during this part of the conversation. It was not hers to speak during. When she left the post office and walked to where Ridley was hitched at the rail, Clara came out behind her. That was well done, Clara said. Garrett did the work? Margaret said. Garrett knew what to look for because someone pointed him in the right direction, Clara said. She looked at Margaret with those sharp eyes. You've been here since September. Yes, Margaret said. You came on the train to marry Whitmore, Clara said. I came on the train, Margaret said. What I was going to do when I got here turned out to be something different than I'd planned. Clara looked at her for another moment. Then she said, There's a women's meeting the first Thursday of the month at the schoolhouse. Practical things, winter preparation, medical knowledge, the kind of information that doesn't get shared formally. We've been doing it for 3 years. I didn't know about it, Margaret said. You do now, Clara said. The next one is in 2 weeks. Margaret rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with the mountains catching the last hour of sunlight and the road soft under Ridley's hooves, and the territory looking for a sustained moment like something she recognized. Not familiar exactly. She'd grown up in Ohio, and the scale of Montana was still something she had to consciously adjust to, the way a room's proportions take time to stop surprising you. But recognized. The way you recognize something you've been told about for a long time and then finally encounter in person and find that the telling was accurate. She was still thinking about the meeting, about Morse's face and Garrett's careful language and Clara's sharp eyes, when she turned into the ranch road and saw Charles Whitmore's horse tied at the post by the front porch. She pulled the wagon up and sat there for a moment. He was on the porch. He'd been waiting, long enough that he'd sat down on the bench by the door, and he stood up when she drove in, and his posture was not the posture he'd had 3 days ago. That posture had been the posture of a man on his own terms, presenting himself. This posture was different, tighter. Something had happened between Tuesday and today. She climbed down from the wagon and tied Ridley to the rail. Whitmore, she said. I need to talk to you, he said. His voice was different too, quieter. The surface polish rubbed thin. We talked 3 days ago, she said. That was different, he said. I need to... He stopped, looked at her. Someone's been talking to Morse. Morse came to see me today with a land lawyer. They're making claims about my investment arrangement that are... He stopped again. Did you do this? She looked at him steadily. I had a conversation with some people in town, she said, about information that was available in public records. That is my business, he said, my private business. A land filing at the territorial office is a public record, she said. The information in it is not private. You had no right, Mr. Whitmore. She kept her voice even, the way she had at the station 7 months ago, with the rain falling and the crowd watching. Harlan Morse invested a substantial sum of money based on a representation you made about that property. He had a right to the information that existed about it before he invested. That's all I helped provide. Charles's jaw was tight. You don't understand what this does to my position. I think I understand it reasonably well, she said. And I understand that the discomfort you're experiencing right now is the consequence of a decision you made, not something I did to you. You came here with nothing, he said. It came out with an edge she recognized. The edge that gets into a person's voice when they want to establish hierarchy and can't find solid ground for it. I offered you a way out of nothing. I made a mistake and tried to correct it, and you offered me a transaction, she said. When it suited you and on your terms, and when I no longer fit your terms, you walked away from it in the rain. She held his gaze. What you're calling a way out of nothing was never about me. It was about what you needed. He was silent. I came here with my own mind and my own hands and my own judgment, she said. That is not nothing. I didn't understand that fully when I stepped off that train, but I understand it now. What I've built here. She gestured, a small motion that took in the yard and the barn and the fields beyond. I built that, not because someone offered it to me, because I showed up every day and worked. Charles looked at her. His face had the look of a man seeing something clearly for the first time and finding the clarity painful. I didn't see it, he said finally, quietly. The performance was gone from his voice, just the plain statement remaining. No, she said. You didn't. And Carter did. Carter saw a person standing in the rain and offered her shelter, she said. What happened after that, we built together. Charles was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to fight Morse's claim, he said. That's your decision to make, she said. He doesn't have enough to... That's between you and your lawyers, she said. I'm not in that conversation. He looked at her one more time, and she let him look, and whatever he saw or didn't see in her face, he eventually took a breath, picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the porch rail, and walked to his horse. She watched him mount and turn toward the road. He didn't look back. She stood in the yard until the sound of his horse faded, and then she stood there a little longer in the April afternoon, with the mud drying in the yard and the calves calling in the north pasture, and the kitchen windows of the house she had reorganized and inhabited and slowly, incrementally made into the shape of a life. Elias appeared at the barn door. He'd been there for some of it. She wasn't sure how much. She didn't ask. He came across the yard to her and stood beside her, not close, just present, looking in the direction Whitmore had gone. "He's going to fight it," she said. "He might," Elias said. "Garrett's good. Morse knows what he's doing." "It's going to be public," she said. "It's going to be talked about all over town." "Yes," he said. "People will know I was involved in surfacing it." "People already know," he said. "Clara Hendricks' back room is a lot of things. Private isn't one of them." She absorbed that. "Is that a problem for you?" she asked. "With me here? People knowing I was involved?" He turned and looked at her directly. The evening light was behind him, and she couldn't see his expression with full clarity, but she didn't need to. She knew the shape of his face by now. She knew what the set of his jaw meant, and what the quality of his silence meant, and the difference between when he was thinking and when he'd already thought. "No," he said. "It is not a problem for me." She looked back toward the road. "The Thursday meeting at the schoolhouse," she said. "Clara Hendricks invited me." "You should go," he said. "I intend to." They stood there for another moment. "Thank you," she said. Quietly, the way she'd said it twice before, each time meaning something different and more. "You don't need to keep thanking me," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." He was quiet. Then, "Come inside. I'm not making soup again. It's your turn." She almost laughed again, the same quick, real way as before. This time she let it come. She followed him into the house. The Whitmore matter did not resolve itself quietly. Margaret had known it wouldn't. Small towns don't absorb large scandals quietly. They process them loudly and repeatedly, in the way that communities have always processed the failures of people who presented themselves as more substantial than they were. By the second week of April, the story had spread through Brixton with the particular velocity of information that people feel simultaneously obligated to share and guilty about enjoying. She heard it in pieces. From Clara, who reported the facts with journalistic precision and no visible pleasure. From Danny, who came in from town one afternoon with the barely contained energy of a young man who had news and couldn't decide whether it was appropriate to share it. From Gus, who mentioned it once, flatly, while fixing a harness in the barn, in the manner of a man who had formed a complete opinion and needed exactly one sentence to express it. What the story amounted to, when she assembled the pieces, Garrett had filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office on Morse's behalf. The filing cited the prior water rights claim and the date of its original registration, 14 months before Morse's investment, exactly as Garrett had said in the back room of Clara's post office. 2 of the out-of-territory investors had been contacted and were, according to Clara's information, in correspondence with their own lawyers. Charles Whitmore had retained an attorney from the county seat, a man with a reputation for delay rather than resolution, which told Margaret something about Charles's legal position that his own words had not. She thought about Charles a fair amount in those weeks, not with anger. The anger had done its work in September, and she'd spent the winter composting it into something more useful. She thought about him the way she thought about difficult weather, as a fact of the landscape, neither good nor bad in itself, but requiring a clear-eyed response. She did not think she was a good person for having helped Morse find Garrett. She did not think she was a bad person for it either. She thought she was a person who had seen a situation clearly and acted on what she saw, knowing that her own history with Whitmore colored her judgment and accepting that coloring is part of the picture rather than pretending it wasn't there. That was the honest accounting of it. The Thursday meeting at the schoolhouse was something else entirely. She went the first time not knowing what to expect. She tied Ridley to the rail outside the small building and went in to find 11 women already there, ranging from a girl of about 20, who turned out to be the rancher Henderson's new daughter-in-law, to a woman named Addie Marsh, who was 73 years old, had come to Montana in a covered wagon when she was 19, and had the particular authority of someone who has survived enough winters to have earned an opinion about everything. Clara ran the meeting with the same efficient directness she ran everything. The topic that day was wound care and infection, which turned out to be a subject on which Margaret had more to contribute than she'd anticipated. The heifer's leg had given her practical experience, and the medical guide she'd studied in Cincinnati 20 years ago had left more of an impression than she'd realized until she started talking. She had not planned to talk much. She had planned to listen, to understand the group, to find her footing before she offered anything. Instead, she talked for 15 minutes about plantain poultice and the difference between drawing infections and suppressing them, and when she finished, there was a quality of attention in the room that she recognized as the kind that precedes questions, and the questions came, and she answered them, and by the time she rode back to the ranch, she had been asked to bring written notes to the next meeting. She told Elias about it at dinner. "They asked you to write it down," he said. "The information should be available," she said. "Mrs. Marsh has lived here for 54 years and she knows things about this territory's plants and weather patterns that I'll never know. But she's 73 and the information lives only in her. If it's written down, it persists." "You're going to write down what she knows?" "I'm going to ask her if she'll let me," she said. "There's a difference." Elias ate his dinner. "You're building something," he said. "I'm writing things down," she said. "That's what building looks like at the beginning," he said. She looked at him across the table. He was looking at his plate, and the line of his face in the kitchen light was the face she had been looking at across this table for 7 months, and she knew it now, the way she knew the ranch's fence lines and pasture patterns, and the sound the back door made in cold weather versus warm, from repeated, daily, unremarkable contact that had accumulated into something that was simply part of how she understood her world. She thought about that for a moment, and then let the thought settle, and asked him how the North Pasture drainage was coming along. The Whitmore matter reached its formal conclusion in May. It came without announcement, the way legal resolutions usually do. Not a dramatic public moment, but a document filed and a payment arranged and a general rearrangement of circumstances that people learned about gradually. Garrett sent word through Clara that Whitmore had reached a settlement with Morse and the 2 out-of-territory investors, a partial repayment drawn from the sale of land assets, including a significant portion of the east parcel that had been at the center of the dispute. The water rights claim was formally recorded against the remaining parcel. What Whitmore kept was considerably less than what he'd had the previous summer, and what he'd had the previous summer was considerably less than what he'd presented himself as having. Clara told Margaret this in the post office, with the door closed, in the same precise, unemotional tone she used for everything. "He's not ruined," Clara said, "but he's reduced." "Is Morse whole?" Margaret asked. "Mostly," Clara said. "He's not recovered everything, but he can absorb the loss without serious damage to his business." Margaret nodded. "You're not satisfied," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know what I expected to feel," Margaret said. "I didn't do it for satisfaction." "I know that," Clara said. "I'm saying you don't look satisfied, not that you should." Margaret looked at the window. Outside, Brixton's main street was doing its May business, wagons and foot traffic, and the ordinary movement of a town going about its day. "He's still here," she said. "He is," Clara said. "So I'm going to see him, eventually." "Probably at the summer market," Clara said. "That's where everyone sees everyone they'd rather not." Margaret absorbed this. "All right," she said. She saw him at the summer market in June. It was a Saturday, the 3rd of the month, and the market ran along the main street of Brixton with wagons and stalls and the general productive chaos of a community gathering. She was there with Elias, ostensibly to sell 2 of the older horses he'd decided to move this season and to check the price on a harrow attachment he'd been considering. In practice, they both knew that the summer market was also the town's main social event of the first half of the year, and that being present mattered in ways that had nothing to do with horses or harrows. She saw Charles from 20 feet away, between a wagon selling dry goods and a stall where a woman was demonstrating a butter churn. He was standing with another man. She didn't know him, and he was not looking at her. Then he was. He held her gaze for a moment. His face had changed since April, not dramatically, not in the way that a sudden illness changes a face, but in the way that a sustained reckoning changes one. Something had settled in it. The polish was still there, but it sat differently, closer to the bone, with less of the performance quality it had carried before. He nodded once. She nodded back. That was the whole of it. He turned back to his companion. She kept walking. Elias, beside her, had noticed. She was aware of that without looking at him, but he said nothing, and after a moment she said, "He nodded." "I saw," Elias said. "That's probably the best outcome available," she said. "Probably," he agreed. They bought nothing that morning and sold both horses at a fair price in the afternoon, and she spent 2 hours at a table Claire had set up near the schoolhouse, where the Thursday meeting women had organized a display of the written materials Margaret had been compiling. The wound care notes, the winter preparation guide, the plant identification pages that Addie Marsh had dictated over 3 sessions at Addie's kitchen table while Margaret wrote. 6 women came and looked at the materials. 2 of them asked to borrow the wound care pages. The wife of the man who owned the hardware store stood reading the plant identification section for 10 minutes without moving. It was a small thing. She had stopped apologizing to herself for valuing small things. The question of what Margaret and Elias actually were to each other had been sitting between them since October, when she'd told him she'd stay through the first snowfall, and had stayed, and they'd both proceeded to not discuss the larger question while addressing every practical thing around it. She understood this was a specifically human kind of avoidance, not dishonest exactly, but careful. The way you're careful around a fire, you're not sure you've built well enough to be safe yet. She thought he might say something in May, when the Whitmore matter closed. He didn't. She thought he might say something after the summer market. He didn't. It was July when he finally said it, and it was nothing like how she'd imagined it would be, because almost nothing in the last 10 months had been how she'd imagined it would be. They were fixing the fence on the south property line. He was replacing posts, and she was running the wire, which was not elegant work, but was work she had gotten competent at over the winter when she'd helped Danny with the repairs. It was a hot afternoon, the kind of July heat that arrives in Montana like an argument you weren't expecting from the season, and they'd been working for 3 hours, mostly in silence. She was pulling wire tight on the third-to-last post when the staple she'd driven pulled through the wood and the wire snapped back and caught her across the back of her right hand. She made a sound, not a large one. Elias was there immediately, not in a rush, just efficiently, the way he moved when something required his attention. He took her hand and looked at the cut, which was not deep but was along the knuckles in the way that stings with particular commitment. "It's fine," she said. "Hold still," he said. He had a cloth in his pocket. He always had a cloth, she'd noticed, some habit from years of working alone where you learn to carry what you might need. He folded it and pressed it against the cut and held it, her hand in both of his. She looked at their hands. His were larger and considerably more weathered, and had the particular character of hands that had been working hard ground for 30 years. Hers were not small, and had not been soft since Harold died, and the cut was going to leave a small scar on the knuckle of her index finger. He was looking at her hand, too. "Margaret," he said. "Yes," she said. He didn't say anything else for a moment, just stood there in the July heat with her hand in his and the fence wire on the ground between them and the Montana sky going blue and enormous overhead. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Saying things directly when the things are—" He stopped. "When the things matter." "I know," she said. "I've noticed. That's not—" He looked up at her. "That's not a character flaw I'm particularly proud of." "It's a character fact," she said. "I'm not asking you to be different." He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were still around hers, the cloth against the cut, and she could feel his pulse in his palms, steady and present. "I don't want you to leave," he said. Not dramatically, not with the weight of a declaration, just plainly, in the voice he used for true things. "Not this fall, not in the spring, not when the situation is more comfortable or the arrangement makes more sense, or some better version of things comes along. I want you here. That's..." He paused. That's the thing I haven't said. She looked at his face, the creases around his eyes deeper now than in September, from a winter and a spring of outdoor work. The jaw that she'd thought on the first day looked like it had been built from corners. The specific quality of his seriousness, which was not heaviness, but was the weight of a man who had considered something from every available angle before he spoke. Why haven't you said it? She asked. Because I didn't know if you had other things you wanted, he said. Things that weren't here. Things that a ranch in Montana and a man who's bad at saying things couldn't give you. She thought about that honestly. She thought about Ruth's spare room in Cincinnati. She thought about the laundry on Geary Street, and the advertisement in the newspaper, and the 3 weeks on a train, and the rain on a platform, and a man who had looked at her and seen nothing worth keeping. She thought about 20 quiet minutes every morning that belonged entirely to her. About the Thursday meetings and Addie Marsh's voice and the sound of a fence post going into Montana ground. About the ledger on the desk, and the hay in the barn, and the calves that were up and walking because she had steady hands, and Danny Reyes hadn't thought twice about asking her. About a bowl of adequate soup on a night she'd been out in the dark for 3 hours, and someone had put food on the stove. I had other things I wanted, she said. I found them here. He absorbed that. Not because you were here, she said. I want to be accurate about that. I built them. You gave me the ground to build on. That's different from giving me the things themselves. I know it's different, he said. I'm not saying it to be contrary, she said. I'm saying it because it matters to me that I know the difference between being given something and building something. I spent most of my life being given things, a marriage, a situation, a set of expectations, and accepting them and working within them. This is the first time I've built what I actually wanted. She looked at him. I needed to know I could do that before I could choose anything else. He was quiet. And now? He said. Now I know, she said. So now I can choose. And what do you choose? He said. He said it simply. No performance in it. Here, she said. You, this. She looked at the fence line, the field, the house visible at the far end of the property in the afternoon light. This specific, difficult, inconvenient, imperfect life. Something happened in his face. Not a smile, not quite. Elias Carter did not produce expressions that were that easily named. But something came and went in his eyes that she understood was the outward edge of something significant happening inside him. Something he would not describe in words because he didn't have the vocabulary for it, but that was real and large and had been building for 10 months. All right, he said. All right, she said. He was still holding her hand. He became aware of this at the same moment she thought about it, and he looked down at the cloth against her knuckle and said, This should be cleaned properly when we get inside. I know, she said. I have plantain salve in the kitchen. Of course you do, he said. She did almost laugh then. She let it come. They went back to the fence. They married in August at the Brixton Courthouse on a Wednesday morning when the weather was clear and the mountain range to the north was sharp-edged against a sky that had no interest in being dramatic about anything. Clara Hendricks was there, because Clara was the kind of person who made herself available at significant events without being invited and was never wrong to do so. Danny Reyes came in from the ranch in his good shirt, visibly moved in the way that young people are moved by things they haven't yet learned to flatten. Gus Pollard stood in the back with his hat in his hands and his expression set to its permanent neutral, which she had come to understand as his version of deep feeling. Addie Marsh came. This surprised Margaret more than anything else that day. Addie was 73 and lived 3 miles outside town and did not move easily. And when Margaret asked her afterward how she'd known to come, Addie looked at her with the particular tolerant patience of someone who has been watching people be obtuse about obvious things for 50 years. Clara told me, Addie said. You didn't have to make the trip, Margaret said. I've been watching women come to this territory and get used up by it for 50 years, Addie said. When one of them lands right, I make the trip. There was no ceremony beyond the legal requirement. Elias said the words in the voice he used for true things. Margaret said them back. It took 11 minutes. They walked out into the August morning as married people, and Elias took her hand. the one with the small scar on the index finger knuckle, and held it briefly, and she felt the steadiness of it move through her in a way she hadn't expected to feel at 57 years old standing on a courthouse step in Montana. She had expected to feel settled, resolved, the satisfying click of a thing arriving at its rightful place. What she felt was more complicated and more honest than that. She felt that she had arrived somewhere, yes, and she felt clearly that the arriving was not an ending, that this was not the conclusion of something, but the solid ground from which something continued, that the work was not done, would not be done, that there were more winters coming and more problems that did not have clean solutions, that she was marrying a man who was bad at saying things that mattered and who would continue to be bad at it and would continue also to mean them absolutely. She felt that she was 57 years old and she had chosen something. After 57 years of circumstances choosing for her, Harold, the debt, the laundry, the newspaper advertisement, the train, the rain, the platform, she had finally stood still long enough in a place she'd built herself to choose what came next. This felt, more than anything else, like the thing she'd been moving toward without knowing it. Not the wedding, and not the ranch, and not even Elias, but the ability to choose. The knowledge that she had enough standing in her own life to make a choice that was actually hers. The summer moved into fall. The cooperative feed buying arrangement she'd organized in March came to its first practical test in August, when the 4 ranches placed their joint advance order with aldermen. The price they negotiated was 22% below what any of them had paid the previous September. It was not a large sum in absolute terms, but it was real money, and for the smallest of the 4 operations, it was the difference between a tight winter and a manageable one. Margaret knew this because she had done the arithmetic for all 4 operations at the Thursday meeting in July, sitting at the schoolhouse table with the women who managed the books for their families' ranches, walking through it together. The wound care guide had been copied by hand 4 times by August. She knew because she'd counted the requests. Addie Marsh had been to the ranch twice, once to continue the plant dictation, and once simply because she wanted to see the north pasture where the wild bergamot grew, which she said she hadn't visited in 8 years since her knees began their long campaign against her. Margaret drove her out in the small wagon, and Addie walked slowly along the pasture edge with a stick and named things, and Margaret wrote them down, and it was one of the most useful afternoons she had spent since arriving in Montana. She thought about this sometimes, in her 20 morning minutes, though the minutes had changed shape slightly since August, had become something she was more likely to share than to keep entirely to herself, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, while the dawn came in gray and clear through the window. The particular form of useful that she had become. She had not been useless before. That was the thing she needed to be honest about, the thing that was easy to flatten into a simpler story. Woman discarded, woman rebuilds, woman proves worth. That story was true in outline, but wrong in the particular. She had not been useless in Cincinnati. She had managed Harold's accounts and kept a household and worked a laundry and survived. She had been useful in every setting she'd been placed in. What she had not been, in any of those settings, was herself choosing what her usefulness would look like. That was the actual thing. Not that she'd discovered hidden abilities. The abilities had always been there, sitting in her the way water sits in ground that hasn't been tapped. It was that here, on this particular piece of Montana ground, at the specific age of 56 going on 57, going on 58, she had finally been the one to decide where to aim them. The wound care guide, the feed buying arrangement, the ledger analysis, Birch and his hay and his unfinished barn edition, the heifer's leg, Danny's gloves, Addie's knowledge, pulled out of her head and put into a form that would outlast her. None of these things had been assigned to her. None of them had been part of any arrangement or expectation. She had looked at the situations around her and thought about what was needed and done what she could do. That was it. That was the whole of it. She mentioned something like this to Elias one evening in September, a year after she'd arrived, sitting on the porch watching the light go off the mountains. She didn't say it philosophically. She said it practically, the way she said most things, in the context of a conversation about whether the Thursday materials should be formalized into a proper written collection that could be kept at the schoolhouse. I think the things that are most useful are usually the things nobody assigned you to do, she said. Elias was quiet for a moment. Say more. She thought about how to say it. When I was younger, I believed that the way you earned your place somewhere was to do what was expected well, she said. And that's true partly, but the things that actually changed things here, none of them were expected. Nobody told me to look at your ledger. Nobody told me to go see Birch. Clara didn't know she needed someone to go talk to Morse until someone did it. You did those things, he said. I did them because I was paying attention, and I wasn't waiting for permission, she said. I spent 30 years waiting for permission, and this is what happened when I stopped. He sat with that. I think you would have stopped eventually, he said, with or without coming here. She considered it. Maybe, she said, but here gave me the room to stop. A place with enough space that I could stand up straight without bumping into the walls. He looked at the mountains. Montana is good for that, he said. You were good for that, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, we were good for that. She looked at him, the line of his profile against the fading sky, the autumn coming in the way it did here, with the particular sharp clarity of a place that doesn't mess around about seasons. Yes, she said, we were. The anniversary of her arrival came on a Thursday. She was at the schoolhouse for the meeting in the morning, which had grown from 11 women to 19 over the year, and now regularly included topics that had moved well past wound care: financial management for ranch households, legal rights for women in land transactions, the plant guide which Addie had extended twice with topics she'd remembered after the first dictation. She came home in the early afternoon and found Elias not in the barn or the fields, but on the porch, sitting on the bench where Charles Whitmore had sat in April, which she thought about for a half second and then let go. He had a small package on his knee. She looked at it. What's that? She said. I'm not a man who buys things often, he said, or who marks occasions particularly well. That's another character fact rather than a virtue. I know, she said. He held out the package. She sat beside him on the bench and opened it. Inside was a small book, a good one, bound properly, with blank pages. And a pen. She looked at it. For the materials, he said. The wound guide and the plant notes and whatever else you're putting together. You've been writing on loose pages. They get disordered. She held the book and looked at the blank first page. This is a practical gift, she said. Yes, he said. It's a good one, she said. I thought so, he said. She sat on the porch with the book in her hands and the September afternoon going quiet around them, and she thought about a woman who had stepped off a train into the rain and been told she was too old to be useful, and she thought about everything that had followed that moment, and she thought that the things which break you and the things which build you are sometimes the same event seen from different distances. She had been broken on that platform. She was honest about that. Not catastrophically, not permanently, but truly. The particular breaking that happens when something confirms what you already half believed about yourself. She had sat on a wet bench in the rain and believed for a while that Charles Whitmore was right about her. And then a man she'd never met had come and stood a respectful distance away and said, without drama, without promise, without anything except the plain recognition of one human being looking at another, you shouldn't have to be alone here. The world does not tell you, when you are 56 and sitting in the rain, that there are still things ahead worth building toward. The world has a way of suggesting, at that age and in that condition, that the significant chapters are behind you, and what remains is a kind of management of endings. The world is wrong about this. That was the thing she wanted written down somewhere, in a book that would outlast her, in words that might find their way to someone else sitting on a wet bench in the rain somewhere. The world is wrong about this. She opened the book to the first page and wrote the date. September 14th, 1 year. Then she sat with Elias on the porch and looked at the mountains and listened to the ranch going about its ordinary, difficult, ongoing life around them, and let the afternoon be exactly what it was, imperfect and sufficient and entirely, completely hers.